Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I'm joined with another guest, Nathan Hoobler, who, what exactly is your role for Adventures in Odyssey focused on the family right now?
Well, my official title is Adventures in Odyssey producer, and that can mean a lot of different things. It can mean working on the pre-production side of things, so ideas and brainstorming. It can mean scripting, it can mean directing, it can mean casting, it can mean post-production, voice editing, things like that. So essentially it means I'm involved in a lot of different parts of the process. Producer can mean almost anything in Hollywood. If you watch a movie or a TV show, there are a lot of producers on those things. But for us, it just kind of means whatever they need me to do.
Okay. How did you first start working with Focus on the Family?
Well, I grew up listening to Odyssey. I was a fan of Odyssey from when I was about 8 years old on, which is almost the whole history of the show. And I listened all through my childhood and my teenage years, and then when I was in college, I started a fan website about the show and started. It's still up there if people want to see it. Adventures in Odyssey headquarters, and did some reviews of the episodes, did some like character histories, that kind of thing, and some of the producers and writers, directors, sound designers of the show started contacting me, which was really cool. It was really exciting to have them just emailing me and telling me about the website. And then Mark Drury, who was one of the sound designers at the time, suggested that I come out for an internship at Focus some summer. And so I said, why, yes, that'd be a great idea. So I came out summer of 2000, and then they hired me shortly after that.
Wow, sounds like a dream come true for an Odyssey fan.
Yeah, well, it certainly was, and certainly still is.
I bet. So you kind of, I was looking at the Adventures in Odyssey wiki, and some of the earliest episodes you did coincide with the beginning of the Novacom saga. So what went into creating the Novacom saga? What were the inspirations? Who was sort of the brains behind it? How did that just sort of get off the ground, you know?
Sure. Well, the Novacom saga had its origins with Paul McCusker, and when Paul McCusker came back as executive producer of the show, he was working with some people that were new, at least new to him, on the Odyssey team. And so kind of his default at that point is when he's working with a new team is to create a story arc of some kind that all the team can work around, common storyline and common characters who are headed in a certain direction. And so he thought it'd be a good time to do a story arc. And he also had just read a book called Timeline by Michael Crichton, and it's about time travel, but it's about time travel for the reason that they're doing time travel is for corporate reasons. There are corporations who are doing this for profit. And he thought that might be kind of interesting if there are people out there who are doing these things, these real kind of cutting edge of science kind of things. Now, at that time, the book, well, even now, the book is still science fiction, but he was thinking, what sort of things are corporations out there working on that could have implications for our world? And I believe he was also, I don't know exactly where the idea for radio waves to brainwaves, and brainwaves to radio waves, where that came from, but he was thinking of, that might make an interesting story arc if you have this company who's trying to do things that seem like they're for a good reason, converting brainwaves to radio waves. Think of the implications for handicapped people. That could be a very good thing. But what they're actually doing it behind the scenes for is the opposite, radio waves to brain waves, so something akin to mind control. And so that's really where the idea started, and it was when I first arrived in 2000, Paul and the team were already on the track of creating the origins of the Novacom saga. It wasn't called Novacom back then, but they were already on track of creating those episodes, and then I got involved with it as the storyline went on.
Wow. Now, so basically from the beginning, it was intended the antagonist would be a corporation, right?
Yes, yeah. The bad guys were always intended to be some sort of corporate entity.
Okay. Now with Novacom, one of the things I re-listened to the Novacom story arc recently. I probably hadn't heard it in probably over 10 years. I quit listening to it when I went to college. I quit listening to Odyssey when I went to college around 2006.
Mm-hmm.
Not completely, but keeping up with the new content. I kind of dropped off after that. And it's interesting that in a lot of ways, Novacom was kind of going between gearing for kids and moving into some young adult themes, which normally I think Odyssey had shied away from. A couple of examples would be dangerous, not quite violent, but almost violent scenes, like, for instance, the car chase with Jack Allen and Novacom. Also, the fact that it's quite strongly implied that Arthur Dent is psychologically tortured. And then also, when Novacom is setting up camp in Odyssey, when Whitaker stands up as sort of an opponent to the Novacom, their sort of content, what they're producing, he basically insinuates that there's violence and sexual content. And the only other episode I could think of in Avengers and Odyssey prior to that broached the idea of sexual content was when Rodney Rathbone becomes a famous singer, and he's singing these.
You got to be wise.
The explicit lyrics. It's implied, and some of the young people, I think, it might have been Robin, and Whitaker talks to her and says, this stuff is bad. It's in your mind. You may not be acting on it right now, but you're putting this pollution in your mind that's weighing it down. But to see a story arc where so many young adult themes that had heretofore not been very common in Odyssey was interesting. Was there a reason behind that? Was it an attempt to just move to a new level?
I don't know that there was like a conscious effort to say, well, let's make the show older. But I think it's natural with story arcs when you get into continued stories and more complexity. The stories tend to get a bit more mature, and we're dealing with a bit more mature kinds of content. I think that Novacom, in some ways, we'd still look back at that and say, it was right up to that edge as far as how far we'd want to go with Odyssey, and that we don't want to be there all the time with our content in terms of things that seem like we're pushing into maybe a little bit older than our audience is. But I think it's also a mark of how much the listeners to Odyssey have changed over 30 years, in that in the very early shows, like just rambling on a bit here, taking a slightly different direction to answer your question, but in the case of The Secret Room, when Paul McCusker wrote the first draft of that, there was a gun in that episode instead of a poison dart. And at the time, the feeling was, well, we can't have a gun on Adventures in Odyssey. We can't even say the word gun on Adventures in Odyssey. That's too much for our show. Whereas now we'd say, well, we can say the word gun. We're not going to be too violent, but we don't feel like that's something that will scare the kids just to say that word. And I think that's just a mark of what was going on with Novacom, is that we felt like, well, kids today, it's okay to go a little bit further with some of the intensity. Now, certainly in terms of some of the content you were mentioning, even still, we're very careful about that. We don't want to take the innocence away from kids. At the same time, you also have to say, if we're going to do some kind of a story arc, how can there be some kind of a threat? And if you're going to have some kind of a threat, how can you do that without having some sort of somebody being in danger? And so you kind of go down that track. So it's always been a balance with Odyssey of how far can you go to be exciting, but not too far that it's too much for kids, parents aren't comfortable with it, or it just feels like, oh, this isn't for 8 to 12-year-olds anymore. So it's always something we're talking about, and we talk about it anytime we have one of those kind of stories.
Okay. Now, the aversion early on to any references to a gun, is that why in the episode where Whit finds, well, they did mention a gun, that's right. The guy that found the skeleton in the closet from that drifter in the 50s. But the actual bank robbery was perpetrated by the bank manager who uses the poison darts. But
Right.
then I remembered they
Yes.
had a gun, so never mind. It was already implied.
Yeah, there was a bullet hole in the shirt, but there wasn't. No one was actually in the real world, or the present day, I guess you'd say. No one was actually threatened with a gun in that show.
Yeah.
Now, since then, we have had moments where someone was held at gunpoint on Odyssey, and so in a way, our line of what we're comfortable with has shifted a little bit. But I think that's also shifted with our audience over the last 30 years.
Even though it's not explicitly mentioned in the episode, the greatest, I think it was called The Greatest Summer Vacation Ever, wasn't the one
Great
guy...
Adventure of the Summer.
Yeah, wasn't the guy implicitly held up by a gun?
Implicitly, probably. Now, I don't know that...
That's what I thought.
Yeah, so it's implied without necessarily saying it, which is curious. Like even on an episode like The Perfect Witness, in The Perfect Witness, the implication is that the bad guys at the beginning have guns, but that's still never mentioned. The word is actually never mentioned. They don't say,
Yes.
"Here, I have a gun," or "Look out, or I'm going to shoot you." They don't actually say that, but it's implied. And so often we'll try something like that. We'll try to imply, the threat of violence without being too explicit about the violence itself.
Yeah, yeah. Now, as far as some of the characters that are unique to the Novacom saga, now the name makes one want to connect Arthur Dent with Arthur Dent from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but there really doesn't seem to be any character similarities. Was there any intention to connect the two characters, or was it just a name that was randomly chosen?
In a way, it was random. In the script, it was Preston Dent. The script that Marshall Younger had written had Preston Dent in there. And then the actor who was cast for it was British. And so in the studio, we actually have this moment in the Making of Novacom hour-long documentary that we did. We have a clip of the moment in the studio where Paul McCusker went to the actor and said, "I think of changing this to Arthur Dent. Isn't that from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy?" And he just thought it sounded more British than Preston Dent. And so it was kind of a spur-of-the-moment kind of idea of, hey, let's use this name. But there wasn't any intention to connect the actual characteristics of this person to the character in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It was just kind of, hey, this is a fun name that some people may recognize from this series, which has to do, a lot of the Novacom names have to do with things in outer space, because we're talking about Galaxy and Nova and Andromeda. So it made sense that, well, if Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy has this character, well, it can be this gentle reference to it. There's certainly not much about the plotting of Novacom. I don't think that bears much resemblance to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's a pretty different kind of story. But yeah, there was at least a slight intention to reference the character with that name.
Okay. Who was sort of the inspiration for the main, well, the villain we see the most, Mr. Charles?
Who was the inspiration? Actually, that's something I don't know. I was around when that character was created, but I don't know if there was a particular person who we had in mind for that character, or a particular actor or literary character. There's not one that I can think of. I think one of the interesting things about the development of that character is that when this person first appeared, the first time you hear this person's voice is in the end of the episode Breaking Point. And at that point, at the point of Breaking Point, we had not decided that this was Mr. Charles. I don't think that name was even discussed. And we hadn't decided that this was going to be like the big villain for the series, at least the big villain that we hear his voice. It just so happened that Jess Arnell, who plays Wooten, was also in the studio, and we said, well, we have this one scene. Could you play the villain in here? And we liked the voice he did enough to say, let's use this character as the main villain later on. Another thing that was different about Novacom that I know Paul McCusker was pretty adamant about making it different from the Blackguard Saga, trying to make it have a different feel. And so where the Blackguard Saga had very much one central villain that they were fighting, I mean, there were other villains on his side, but there was one big bad guy, and it was all his plan. The Novacom Saga had more a series of bad guys, and you weren't quite sure who was the who was good and who was bad. With Dr. Blackguard, you pretty much knew from the beginning this is the bad guy. With Novacom, there was a little bit more of the who's good and who's not. And I think in a way, some people probably liked the Blackguard character more in that way because he was much more central. This is the big baddie. Whereas Novacom didn't really have that real strong central villain who's like really interesting and really scary. So I think that's a long story to say. With Mr. Charles, there wasn't as much intentionality to make him the big villain from the beginning like there was with Dr. Blackguard.
Okay, so he kind of just evolved into the role as you were casting the episodes.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough.
How about Monica Stone? What was the inspiration for Monica Stone?
Again, I can't think of a particular person who was an inspiration for her. We're looking for someone that Jason could actually develop some feelings for, and then she turns out to be a bad girl. So, so that's really, I think she developed somewhat from trying to find a voice, and we asked several actors, including, I believe, it was Katie Lee who referred us to Melissa Disney. Melissa Disney is the one who plays Monica Stone, and she's actually played a number of parts for us over the years. She most currently plays young Jenny Whitaker on the show. But we went to Katie looking for this kind of a voice that I think the way that we went about looking at was a voice that sounded attractive. And so Katie suggested, well, you should try Melissa Disney. She has a really good voice like that. And so once we heard the voice, I think the character largely developed around that voice. Yeah.
Now, the character of Mitch, who is, of course, very important due to his relationship with Connie, was it intentional that he be kind of a Richard Maxwell-esque character? Because near the end of Novacom, some of his activities with Jason mirror some of Maxwell's activities with Jason at the end of the Blackguard saga, where they team up to take down the bad guy.
Yes, in a way intentional, in a way not, because originally when the episode where Aram is first introduced, Red Herring, when Aram was first introduced, the intention was that RM would be Richard Maxwell. Richard Maxwell was going to be a part of this series. But the voice actor who played Richard, Nathan Carlson, was not available at the time. So when we came to the Plan B episodes where we were going to find out who Aram was, Nathan Carlson was not available. And so by that point, we had made the decision, well, I guess we will have Aram be Robert Mitchell instead. And in fact, we had made that decision episodes before that because we knew that Nathan wasn't available. But when we very first introduced Aram, the idea was that it was going to be Richard Maxwell. And so, yes, there are some definitely similarities between Mitch and Richard. And part of that was because the character was first supposed to be Richard Maxwell. And
Does
it would have
that
been
mean
a very
that
different saga. At least that section of it would have been very different if Richard Maxwell was part of it.
Does that mean that the original intent was to have Richard Maxwell and Connie have feelings for each other?
No. It was originally going to be two different characters. And, well, I suppose it still is two different characters, but Maxwell didn't end up being part of it. But the intention was that Mitch was going to be accused of being Aram, but wasn't actually Aram. It was Richard Maxwell. And then Richard Maxwell would turn out to be Aram, and Mitch would be vindicated. But then when Nathan wasn't available, then said, well, I guess Mitch is going to be Aram after all.
Okay. The other thing was with Novacom, it seems like at the end, when of course they get thwarted when Whitaker has Tom over type in applesauce to destroy the duplicate imagination station, the sort of chairman, he's just called the chairman, he escapes. It seems like they opened it up for a possible sequel to Novacom, but as of yet there has been none. Was that the intention? And is that still the intention, or is it just in the past now?
Well, it has been a while since Novacom. It's been, I think, about 15 years since the finale of Novacom aired. So if you've listened to Odyssey for a long time, you know that things do come back after a pretty long period. There are often characters who appear on the show after a very long time that will bring people back. At the time, we were intending that, at some point we may come back to this. Maybe not Novacom itself, but we may come back to this bad guy. And I think just shortly before the session, if my memory is correct, the original line for the chairman was, "It's over, it's over." But then I think Paul McCusker, again, if my memory is correct, is the one who changed it to, "It's over for now." So it left it open to, if we ever want to do anything with this again, we can still bring this character back. But yeah, to date, we haven't come back to that. I think because we feel like there's more to do with other characters necessarily than revisiting Novacom. Another thing that changed a bit about the ending of the show is that, the ending of Novacom at least, is that there was a lot of guessing on the fan websites toward the end of Novacom about who the chairman was. And we hadn't intended the implication to be, oh, the chairman is someone you know, and it's going to be revealed to be a gasp who the chairman is. But listening to those episodes again, myself more recently, I realized it does kind of feel that way. Like when we find out who the chairman is, it's going to be someone we know, and it's going to be this big surprise. So I think there was some disappointment from people when, oh, the chairman is just a new character. It's not somebody who we know who, oh, gasp, this is this big twist. It's just a new person. So I think that was another reason that we felt like there's not that much with this character. It was just supposed to be kind of the person behind the scenes, but it wasn't supposed to be a big new villain who's going to develop into future episodes. So though we may have unintentionally implied that, we didn't really have big plans for the chairman after Novacom.
Okay. Now, like you said, some characters go away and come back. One character, of course, is Mitch. He was gone for quite a while. But
Several times.
Yeah, but after the Novacom story arc ended, he was gone for a while. Now he's since come back. It seems like I get the impression at the end of Novacom, maybe it wasn't intentional on the creators, that there was an attempt to leave loose ends that would intentionally be used to tell new stories. Like, for instance, Monica and Jason, that just went nowhere at the end. There was a clear indication that there was something that there was the possibility of something that would go on between Monica and Jason. We already talked about the chairman. It seems like that there were there was at least an intent to leave some openings for future references, if not to a new Novacom story arc, at least to reuse some of the other characters. So was that actually the case, or is it just an apparent case?
Well, I think at the time there were some things that were left open, and there are some things that we have gone back to. For example, with Tom and Agnes, you left Agnes in in Hillingdale Haven, and it was pretty sad ending between the two of them. And not long after that, we picked up on that, and we had an episode called The Pact, which is one that I worked on, where we actually got to see more of Tom and his wife, and continue that storyline. And the reason that we did continue the storyline is where we had left it with Novacom. And then also you mentioned Mitch, and Mitch and Connie certainly continued after Novacom, and even continued into an episode not all that long ago. So yes, there was some intentionality just to say, this is not the end of the series. Adventures in Odyssey is not ending, even though this Novacom thing has continued on for 30-some episodes. We do want to leave some storylines that are going to continue on, and we're still going to reference some of the things that happened with Novacom after the fact. But on several of those, like you mentioned with the chairman, and then also with Jason and Monica, I think when we closed that down, we had some idea, maybe we'll come back to this at some point, but we didn't have a big storyline planned out for the two of them. And I think Jason's moved on so far from where that is, I'm not sure if we'd ever come back to that. Now, again, characters have a tendency to come back after long periods on the show, so there's nothing to say that Monica would never come back. We just don't have any plans for it.
Yeah. Now, I guess another question is, a lot of times when characters are not present in a show, it's because they weren't able to be contracted to act. Was that one of the reasons why Eugene doesn't appear really at all during the Novacom saga? Was that intended to be that way, or is that the result that they couldn't acquire the actor?
I'd say mostly the latter, is that that was something that the actor wasn't available during that time. When we had started the Novacom saga, we were thinking that we were going to be able to have Will in the studio, Will Ryan, who plays Eugene, have him be a part of the show and a part of maybe the second half or the conclusion of Novacom. But then when he still wasn't available to us, we still couldn't use him, then we had to do the whole Novacom saga without Eugene. Now, interestingly enough, I think one of the things about a series like Odyssey and really most creative endeavors is that when you come to roadblocks like that, it ends up being an opportunity for something creative. And so because Will wasn't available to us during Novacom, we were able to construct another storyline later on with Eugene returning, and then eventually Eugene and his father and going to Africa. All that came out of him being gone for a period, so it gave us an opportunity to do something else. But when we first started Novacom, the intention was that Eugene would be a part of it at some point. And he did end up being a part of it, but it was pretty much all off screen.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that was interesting about the way you handled Aram, or Aram, however you say his name, is, of course, there's this tension early on with Alex and his cousin about, talking to strangers on the internet. And of course, in the early 2000s, when the internet was a relatively new thing, there was a lot of, parental concern about children talking to strangers on the internet. And it was interesting how you handled it, rather than sort of having okay, doing what might be expected, never talk to strangers, it's dangerous. You somehow work that into that he's actually the good guy. And even though Alex and his cousin are kind of bending their parents' rules, it still works out for the greater good. That normally in Adventures in Odyssey, when the parents give a clear delineation, okay, don't do this, and the children do what they're not supposed to do, really bad things happen to the kids. But here it seems in this case that even though curiosity got the better of them, it was inadvertently for the good.
Yeah.
Which is not what you normally see in Adventures in Odyssey.
Yeah, that is a little bit different than normal. I think that it certainly was never our intention. I mean, we would never want to say, well, go against your parents' wishes and good things will happen. We'd never want to say that on Odyssey. I think part of it just came out of the plotting of things, is that, at a certain point, something good is going to have to happen. And was that caused by what Alex and Cal did? I don't know that it was caused by it. It may have been part of what they did led to that. I don't know that this was really our intention at the time, but I think it can kind of show that God works all things together for good, whether we intend good along the way or not. But I guess the simple answer would be we didn't intend to imply, well, go against your parents' wishes. And we hope that there's still some semblance of use caution online, because you don't necessarily know who you're talking to online. We hope that there's some semblance of that still in the show. I think it's kind of the nature of these complex storylines, that there are going to be more complex themes and even complex questions to deal with out of them, because they become so, not convoluted, but so complicated, in that you could say, well, are you saying that Alex and Cal, that they should have disobeyed their parents? Of course, we don't intend to say that, but it's possible that something on the show kind of implied that, because we needed that to get to the next level of the plot. So it's a little simpler on like 1 or 2 episode stories than it is with 30 episode stories to keep all of the motivations and the lessons straight. I think that was one of the complaints actually about the Novacom saga from listeners, is that the lessons in these are more complex, and sometimes kids are having trouble digesting these or interpreting them. And so that's a lesson that we've even taken to heart in future stories, that we've had some complex stories since then, but we've tried to make sure that even in the complex storylines, we still have applicable takeaway lessons.
Yeah. There's a couple of questions within the saga that I didn't fully grasp. In the episode where Cal and Alex and Bernard work for Novacom for a period, we know why Bernard's fired. It's pretty clear. But I'm not entirely sure why Alex and Cal were they fired because they were using the computer to talk to Aram, or I'm not entirely clear why they were fired.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that we hoped would be implied and wasn't necessarily clear. There are a few of those in the Novacom saga that even to this day we still get questions about. Another one is in Slumber Party, which wasn't intended as a part of the Novacom saga, but aired during it. There was a scene where the characters saw some spotlights outside, and they were afraid of them. It was supposed to be just this goofy, silly thing that happened, and not connected to the Novacom saga. But because of when it aired, people thought that there was a deeper meaning to the spotlights. But there wasn't anything intended anyway. But for why Alex and Cal got fired, there was an answer to that one. At least what we hoped would be implied was that because they were talking to Aram on a Novacom computer, the idea was Novacom is planting these cameras, it's planting these modems, it's kind of observing, trying to see everything that's going on. So the idea was that Novacom had been watching them this whole time and realized that they were talking to Aram, and so Novacom, their bosses at Novacom, realized that they were talking to this person who was working against Novacom, Aram, and so because of that, that's why they got fired.
Yeah, it was certainly implied, but I just wasn't sure if that was the right conclusion to draw from the implication. But
that was our intention.
Okay. Another example is near the last third of Novacom when Special Agent Borland shows up in a more in a large way. He says to Whit, at least on one occasion, that the main thing that's stopping Novacom is Eugene missing the research, or stealing it and then running away. Yep. And then you yourself, Whitaker. Now I could see why Eugene running away with the research would be a monkey wrench to Novacom. But given how Novacom had been giving Whit the runaround the whole time, I was not quite sure how Whitaker was delaying them or inhibiting their... Was it just the fact that he was a vocal critic and kept people in Odyssey from completely buying into their message?
Yes, good question. I think part of it was that for Novacom's plan, they needed the imagination station. And so I guess you'd say physically what was getting in their way was that they still didn't have the imagination station. And Whit was working against them in several different places. So real early on in the Novacom saga, when they were planning a modem in Whit's office, their plan was to go in and, using that modem, get the plans to the imagination station. And then later on, when they had planted cameras in Whit's office, the intention was that they would somehow figure out how to get the imagination station. And then in the episode Breaking Point, where the plans to the imagination station were stolen, then again, they were trying to get the imagination station, but Mr. Whitaker was one step ahead of them because he left out a key component of it. And so he was getting in their way in that he wasn't allowing them to get what they wanted, which was the imagination station. I think the other part of this was the spiritual component of all of it, was that Novacom was planning on some pretty evil things, and Mr. Whitaker, as the Christian, was getting in their way of doing those things. Now, whether Borland knew that at the time or not, whether Borland was spiritually attuned enough to realize that that was going on, I don't know that that was really our intention or even the implication of that line. But I think that's also what was going on as the series as a whole, is that Mr. Whitaker was coming at all this from a Christian perspective and from a doing what's right perspective, and Novacom clearly wasn't.
Yeah. An interesting theme in the Novacom was the sort of danger of superficial romantic attachment. We see this with how Erica is able to manipulate Nick into finding the underground plans for the imagination station. And we see it how, I just mentioned her name now, but the spy gets Jason to lower his guard down when she tries Monica. And it's interesting, because in both cases, if they had used a little discernment, had not been overcome with superficial romantic attraction, they would have been more prudent and not given Novacom so much of an advantage.
Yeah,
I don't know that there was.
Well, I don't know that the theme about romantic attraction or romantic connections was necessarily intentional. You'd have to check with Marshall or Kathy or Paul just to see if they had intended that. But I do know the discernment angle certainly was. So whether it's discernment about romantic relationships or discernment about other people, discernment about companies, about entertainment choices, that was supposed to be one of the big themes, and I think is one of the big themes of the Novacom episodes, is being discerning and thinking about our actions, thinking about getting involved with another person, or getting involved with this entertainment thing, or this game, or this TV show, or this company. All of that was certainly part of the equation that as Christians, we're supposed to be discerning. And so I think that goes beyond even romantic entanglements are certainly a part of it, but it really goes to all choices in life.
Yeah, you definitely see that. But the one of the highlights of drama in Novacom is when you have I forget her name now. Who was the girl that ran off with Erica and she was caught driving underage?
Oh, Aubrey Shepard.
Aubrey Shepard. Yeah, that whole scene, like how her parents are trying to deal with a rebellious child, but they don't want to drive her away, and they're trying to figure out, well, how do we, on the one hand, keep the child, keep the dialogue open so we can bring her to Christ, but also at the same time let her know that what she's doing is wrong. I think that was a really well handled description of how it must hurt a parent to deal with that.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I was really impressed at how that drama came off. Another, I think, really good part of the drama too was when Whit goes to was it Connellsville to build the other Whit's End, and there's those homeless kids, and he has to earn their trust because they're like, oh yeah, you're like everybody else, yada yada yada. You feel bad for today, but you're gonna feel bad later on. And that idea of winning the trust of those homeless kids, I think, was also a really well done dramatic effect. I mean, that was really top notch for Novacom.
Well, that's in both of those cases. I think with the first, with Aubrey's storyline, that would be John Fornoff, who worked on the scripting of that. And then with the second, with the homeless kids, Nick and Brianna, who were, no, Nick is not the right name, Tony and Brianna. That would be Marshall, who worked on the scripting of that one. In both of those cases, we wanted to keep some very real elements of Novacom, because eventually Novacom got a bit sci-fi, at least bordered on sci-fi, with the brainwaves and radio waves and that sort of thing, but beyond a person's real life experience. So we wanted some real life experiences even in the midst of that. So Aubrey's salvation is very, very real. It is connected to the Novacom saga, but it's not connected to the out there kind of fantasy or science fiction edging aspects of it. We wanted the series to still feel like, there's still parts of it anyway, feel like real life and can have these real down-to-earth lessons for kids who are listening, and not just the intrigue out there kind of elements to it.
Yeah. Actually, there's another unexplained question that I want to know too, is when the radio tower, is set to explode as Cal is climbing the tower. Now, we learned at the end it was set to explode by Arthur Dent. And that's when Cal sees a guy running away. Now, when Tom is running towards the tower, he says it's going to blow. How does Tom know that? Has he been keeping tabs on Dent? And then when he gets knocked out with the explosion, he forgets everything that happened before that. So presumably Dent had the bombs discreetly placed so no one could disarm them. So how did Tom know that Dent had laid bombs there?
Very good question. It's one of those that we went back and forth on the logistics of it time and again, and I think it ended up changing a lot. My explanation, which may not fully explain the question, but my explanation would be that Arthur Dent, is not very rational at this point. So he's not thinking through all of the implications of what he's doing, and not necessarily doing it in a way that's very logical. And so my thought was Arthur Dent set these explosives on the tower. and didn't necessarily hide them that much, because the tower isn't necessarily something that it's out on Tom's, maybe a remote corner of Tom's land somewhere, and people aren't going to visit it all that often. So Arthur Dent set the explosives and ran away. Tom saw him doing this, maybe intended to go do something about it, maybe intended to tell somebody, and then saw that Alex and Cal were there, ran over to rescue them. They're in the tower explosion. Tom loses some of his memory and doesn't remember that, oh, this is what happened. Now, I don't know that you could necessarily draw that conclusion from the episode, and with the number of things that we were trying to tie up, we didn't pause for that long of an explanation. But that was what I was thinking, is that Arthur Dent had run down, set the explosions, run away. Tom saw him doing it, was going to do something about it, then realized kids were in danger, came over to rescue them, and then lost his memory because he was involved in.
Now, wasn't it dusk or nearing night when Cal climbed the tower? I think maybe.
I think that was the case.
Within the context of the Novacom story arc, I think one possible explanation for Tom knowing there's bombs is when Whit is trying to clear Tom's name at the trial, he goes investigating the Timothy Center, and he finds that one of those derelict buildings had a lot of fertilizer in it, and he therefore that's where he ultimately finds Dent. Maybe we could argue that since the Timothy Center is owned by Tom, and Tom would maybe would look at these storage sheds from time to time to do inventory. He saw that something sketchy was going on. Maybe he saw Dent. Maybe he deduced. Maybe he deduced that somebody was trying to do something with the fertilizer, which could be used as a bomb. And then he just forgets all that when he gets knocked out. But
yeah, I think that's a reasonable explanation as well. It's one of those that, being a bit of a completist and always want a satisfying answer to things in the shows. So it's something that I wish we had a little bit more clear, satisfying answer to in the episode. But I think the explanation that you came up with is a pretty good one.
Yeah, I'm a completist too. All the dots got to be dotted, all the I's got to be dotted, the T's got to be crossed. It's gotta line up just right. But in relationship to some of the other contents of Odyssey, rumor has it you're the guru that remembers everything. I don't know if that rumor's true, but Paul McCusker mentioned that. Oh yeah, Nathaniel Hoobler, he's the guru. So one of the interesting things, and I know you weren't behind the scenes on this, but Officer Harley was initially a sort of bumbling policeman, kind of like Don Knotts, I think. And he got pulled.
I'm sure that Barney Fife was one of the inspirations for Officer Harley. Yes.
It's interesting that there was a lot of negative feedback from the parent fan base, and he was eventually pulled and replaced with Harlow Doyle. I like both characters, though I've probably heard more Harlow than I have Harley. But it's interesting that would be a problem. I mean, nobody finds the bumbling Barney Fife to be edgy or suspect. I find it, and most, I think, people of that cultural milieu would have watched in their younger days would have watched Andy Griffith, and it seems interesting that would be a concern.
Well, I think there are a couple of things that are going on there. For one thing, this was very early on, the very first episodes of Adventures in Odyssey, and so the team, Focus on the Family, was very concerned about the messages that we were sending with Odyssey. We still are, but now that we've had 800 plus episodes, we know that you're going to get feedback on every episode, and there are going to be people who don't like an episode at the same time. There are other people who love that same episode for the same reasons that the people didn't like it. So there was a bit more, not sure what the right word is, but there was a bit more focus, perhaps, if you'll pardon the pun, on the negative feedback about some of those early episodes. And so if we got, I think there was only, according to Steve Harris, who was involved at the time, there was really only a handful of complaints about Officer Harley. And if we got a handful of complaints about a character now, we'd still want to take them into the context of, well, do we also have a lot of positive comments about this person? However, the bigger concern about it was not really the number of comments about this character, but how are we presenting authority figures? And that was something that was very important on Odyssey at the time, and still is. It's something that we really want to be very intentional about. And the difference between Officer Harley and Barney Fife was that on the Andy Griffith show, Andy was also a police officer. And so you had, even though Andy, has this kind of country charm to him, he's a very competent police officer. And so he knows how to do his job. And Barney is not so competent, is more the comic relief. He's a very likable character, but you have that competent police officer, and then beside him you have the kind of incompetent police officer. With Odyssey, we didn't have that. We had just the Barney Fife-esque kind of character, the incompetent guy. And so the concern was, because we don't have the positive side, are we only showing police officers to be bumbling fools? And so are we giving kids that impression? And I think, and Steve Harris would say this as well, is that he ultimately, it was frustrated at the time because they built up this new character and then they had to take him out. But he would say ultimately that was the right decision, because it's very important what we tell kids about authority figures. And so Officer Harley had to go, and eventually Harlow Doyle came and was a similar kind of character and didn't have the same problems with authority figures, because it's more acceptable for our show to make fun of private detectives than it is to make fun of police officers. Oh, I lost your audio there.
There you go. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, go ahead.
There was one interesting character early on from the Regis Blackguard saga, Nicholas Adamsworth, who's, sort of used unintentionally by Maxwell. But what I find interesting and not very well explained is the last time he appears is in episode 239, The Power, where he's all of a sudden a bad guy working with the Bones of Wrath. And I'm like, how did little old Nikki turn into a bad guy? I mean, he's this cute little awkward kid, and all of a sudden he's a evil mastermind hacking into the school computers to mess with grades. I feel like that was a rather abrupt and very not adequately explained transformation.
That's something I've always wondered about. In fact, before I came on staff for Adventures in Odyssey, I actually wrote an episode that explained what had happened to Nikki in those years in between the last time that we had heard him in the episode of Prisoner for Christ and then the episode The Power. I'd written an episode that was kind of a flashback to see how Nikki had made that transition from being really very much a good guy to being a shady character, kind of a bad guy. So it is a good question. I mean, we know that happens in real life, is that, you see a person when they're 12 years old and boy, they seem like a nice kid, and then you see them years later and something's gone wrong. So we know that happens in real life. So I don't think it's unrealistic, but it is a bit strange on the series that suddenly Nikki had taken this pretty dark turn. So it's a good question. I don't know that it's something at this point we're ever going to go back and explain. Partially because the actor has passed away since then. But it is a question that I myself have wondered about, and unfortunately, I don't know that we're actually going to answer at this point.
Well, at this time, things get just left behind. One question that I have, and I've noticed this, when you look at the sort of stock villain characters that Adventures in Odyssey will use, of course, Novacom is the evil corporation. You see in the Regis Blackguard saga corrupt local government officials like Philip Glossman. So, local government is corrupt. You also have, not a lot, but a couple times you'll have the Nazis. There was the one episode where Jack and Joanne at their antique shop have that stolen painting. Of course, there's the British and the Confederates and the historical ones like the Revolution and the Civil War. Why have there been no bad guy communists? And especially when this show started in '88, the Soviet Union was still a clear and present danger.
Yes, well, I'm sure that if the Soviet Union had lasted longer in the run of Adventures in Odyssey, we probably would have had some, as you say, to use your term, we probably would have had some communist bad guys on the show. I think that there hasn't been a reason why we didn't do that. It's just that whatever the story has called for, that seemed to make the most sense for us for villains. So I think it was just a side effect of the stories that we were writing and the content of those stories, as far as who the villains have been. So there's certainly never been an intention to pick on people from a particular country or a particular place or background. It's just whatever the story calls for. Well, it seems like this should be the villain. Could you hold on just one second there? I'm actually borrowing someone else's headset, and they may be leaving for the day. So hold on just 1 second. If we can pause our interview for just a second.
Sure.
I'll be right back. Okay. Can you hear me again?
Yeah. But there's usually two contexts in which the villain is introduced in Odyssey. It's either through like the historical episodes, like the Bible episodes or the American history episodes, in which case they're historically contextual and you have to just pick the bad guy that comes with the story.
Mm-hmm.
Other times, it's creative, like Regis Blagger. You needed a bad guy to fill this role. I mean, in fact, you even had terrorists as bad guys in the one episode in the Blackguard Saga with the Roku virus. That's pretty clearly Islamic terrorists. So you've had I just noticed the wide gamut, even if they've only appeared once, like, say, the terrorists with the Roku virus, that it seemed, especially given communism's overtly atheist, anti-Christian attitudes, and the danger that it posed to the world for so long, that it seems a little strange that at least one or two episodes haven't touched on it. There could have been a historical episode about Korea. I don't know, or maybe you have a fictional, like, diehard communist bad guy that hasn't quit fighting the Cold War. I don't know, whatever. I don't know. It seems interesting.
I suppose if you look at some of the episodes, like there are a number of episodes here and there throughout the series that involve the Vietnam War, because Mr. Whitaker's son died in the Vietnam War.
Yes.
And so in a way, in those episodes, it is the Americans fighting against people in Vietnam, and so in some way in that you would have some communist bad guys.
Yeah,
we don't necessarily hear a lot of them, but there's still that communist threat against these people in those episodes. But it's a good question. I mean, it's something that at some point we may have that if the story calls for it. We probably wouldn't start out saying, okay, we've got to do an episode with communist bad guys. That's just what we've got to do in an episode. But if an episode calls for it to make sense, then I don't know that we'd be opposed to that. I think if you see, even with the villains that you were mentioning, villains come from all over the place. I mean, we've even had villains who have come from the church, because that's true historically. So there can be villains coming from all over the place on Odyssey, because there's a bad apple in every bunch, and all of us know from human nature that there can be villains everywhere, and even villains within ourselves. And so I think that's what we try to show on Odyssey, is that villains and evil do not just come from one particular place. They come from a lot of different places, because humanity has fallen, and so you're going to find evil all over the place.
I think another example of Vietnam was with the episode where the son never met his father, and his mother tells him that story about why his father went to Vietnam.
Yeah, Price of Freedom.
It's kind of like the implicit bad guy, like in Manitoulin Point. You never see the Japanese, but it's implied.
Yes.
So I guess in that sense, you could point to those Vietnam episodes with the implied bad guy there. What are your favorite episodes from Adventures in Odyssey? It might be a hard choice. But you grew up listening to it, so it'd be interesting to hear which ones are your favorite.
Well, it does change being on staff with Odyssey versus listening to Odyssey not being on staff, because I think about the episodes very differently. When I think about the episodes in the last 17 years that I've been involved with the show, I think about the final episode and how it turned out, but I also think about everything that went into that episode. And so there are certain episodes that hold a warm place in my heart because of some of the behind-the-scenes stuff. And that wouldn't be the case for the episodes before I came on staff because I wasn't involved in behind the scenes stuff. I know about some of it now, but I wasn't here for it. So my favorite episode before I started working on the show was Waylaid in the Windy City because I just really enjoyed the feel of the show. I enjoyed the twists and turns, the characters, just the some of the surprises of it. I didn't feel like it was predictable. It had a lot of went different directions, I think, than I expected. But then, since I've started working on the show, my favorites in terms of the shows that I've been involved with have changed. My favorite episode that I've worked on is probably an episode called The Pact. It's not. I don't know that it's necessarily my best written episode. I don't know what that would be, but it's the episode that I've gotten the most feedback on personally. That people have told me that it's an episode that touched them, and so it's very humbling that somehow I think God was able to use this episode to touch some different people who listen to it. So it's kind of a little bit of a hedgy answer that I'm giving you several different favorite episodes, but
yeah,
kind of have to divide them into two different categories because I can't really judge the episodes in the same way that I worked on from episodes that I wasn't involved in.
One very interesting observation from the Villainous and Odyssey series is whenever the Room of Consequence is used, with one exception, the person that goes in comes out with the desired attitude change. And the only episode that doesn't happen is where Rodney Rathbone falls through the roof of the building. He has a frivolous lawsuit with the lawyer Wiesel. Now, that's sort of like a kind of massive concession because it's like, well, why didn't it work this time? Is the Room of Consequences kind of is it kind of rigged? You know, it's sort of like this implicit you're not supposed to do that kind of thing, you know? Yeah.
Well, I don't know that there was. It's interesting that you've noticed that because I wouldn't have picked up on that. I think that in that case, that would have been one of the few adults who went into the Room of Consequence. Most of the characters who have gone into the Room of Consequence are children, and so that would be one thing that's a little different. Than perhaps Howard was more set in his ways than most of the people who went into the Room of Consequence. But the other answer would be a more practical one, which is when we're doing a whole episode in the Room of Consequence, we'd want to, the reason that we're doing it is to teach a lesson. The reason we're doing almost every episode is to teach a lesson. And so we'd want a character in there to have a change of heart in some way to reflect the lesson that we're trying to teach. In that episode, if Howard J. Wiesel had learned his lesson and said, okay, I'm going to drop the lawsuit, then it wouldn't have been as dramatic as if he followed through with it. And so it was just necessary for the plot that he not change his mind. The listener gets to see these implications, but he doesn't change his mind. So yeah, that's a observation that I had not picked up on myself. He's perhaps the only one who didn't change after an experience in there, but the intention wasn't that the Room of Consequence had a misfire or something. It's just something that was kind of necessary for that plot.
Was it Eugene? I mean, he went in the Room of Consequence, right? That was the Mortal Coil, wasn't it?
That would have been the Imagination Station.
Oh, that's right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, we're about out of time, but thanks very much for coming on, Nathan.
Of course. Yeah. Well, and thank you for the questions. It's always fun to dive into the details.
Oh, yeah, it always is. This is Todd Lewis, host of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.